Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 29, How Bordeaux Got Its Wine. In September, I went to Bordeaux with a friend who is a verified A-rated wine snob. While I had gone to a few wine tastings, I couldn't explain the difference between a Medoc and a hot Medoc if my life depended on it. I figured that after seeing Paris and all of the Revolutionary War sites and exploring Versailles, by the time we got to Bordeaux, I'd just relax and get some work done and let her go to town on the wine. But when I got there, I realized that Bordeaux is fabulous. I did learn a lot about wine while I was there, but I also learned about the region's appreciation for the history of viticulture. My guest today is Megan Stetzel, one half of the team behind the travel blog Why Wait to See the World. We chat about how Bordeaux got its wine, how in the 19th century it almost lost it, and how the city nicknamed Sleeping Beauty underwent an amazing revitalization in the last 20 years. My guest today is Megan Stetzel. She is one half of the team behind the millennial-focused travel blog Why Wait to See the World. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Stephanie.
So we are talking today about Bordeaux, which for most travel bloggers, when we travel, we end up falling in love with one particular region a little bit more than others. I think my listeners know I'm a little bit obsessed with Bulgaria, and they may not understand why, but I am. But for you, that's Bordeaux. How did you end up falling in love with Bordeaux?
Well, I have let's say, a deep history with wine. My love started very early in life. I worked in the restaurant industry for a good 10 plus years, ended up being the general manager of a restaurant in New York. And through that, it requires some long days of wine tasting and building wine menus and, drinking delicious bottles with high-end clients and things along those lines. But so I've always had a good love of wine. I have to say that being an American, I was always a snob to American wines until I finally ventured over to Europe and started opening my palate a little more. And lucky me, I had a friend who needed a house sitter in Bordeaux. I'd obviously known about the region. In all honesty, I thought Bordeaux was going to be this tiny, itsy bitsy little wine town, like with little sheds and vineyards, and that was it. I had no idea what the city was really about and the rich history that was there, but I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, so when I went, I was also really shocked because, I went on a girlfriend's trip with like my best friend, and we did a few days in Paris and did like Revolutionary War stuff, and I thought that would be the highlight of the trip for me. And then she's like a serious wine drinker, like Wine of the Month Club, buys a bottle to save for 3 years type wine drinker, which doesn't make sense to me. But so I thought we were going to go to Bordeaux for her. I was shocked how much I liked it. And it is because it's got so much history, and they take their wine so seriously that if you don't understand how far back in time wine goes there, they don't even want to talk to you about what's on the menu today. And it's also a UNESCO World Heritage site. So let's talk a little bit about how did wine get started there?
Yeah, I mean, it literally does go back further than you can imagine. Like 2,000 plus years. You can thank the Romans for the beautiful Bordeaux wines. That's the most documented history of wine in Bordeaux, which, that's old enough for me. They started off the vineyard craze in Bordeaux literally just to make wine for soldiers. I think we talked about this before. I mean, this is the first time we're talking about this.
So, listeners, if you remember, there was an episode where I posted a weird episode because the episode I had recorded couldn't get recorded. It was this episode where we recorded probably 25% and then had to stop because the Wi-Fi just didn't hold up. So we're both having a hard time making sure that we're covering everything today.
When you feel like you've said the same thing twice?
Yeah.
Wow. But yeah, so the Romans literally brought wine to the region or made the region a wine region purely so the soldiers could have something to drink. Because back then, water wasn't exactly always the safest thing to drink. So why not just distill it and make it extremely alcoholic and call it wine?
Now, wine back then is not like what we think of as wine exactly. What was their wine like? Like, if we opened a bottle at the time, what would it have been like? I imagine pretty gross.
You'd probably grow some hair on your chest. It was highly alcoholic, really overly fruity, and it didn't age well at all. Like it would spoil within a year, which, if you know anything about Bordeaux wines of today, the older the better. So, I mean, they're still pretty heavily alcoholic because that's the European winemaking way, but they're not typically as fruity of wines anymore, and they obviously age extremely well nowadays. So very, very different.
So, the city is actually a UNESCO World Heritage City, and it's called Bordeaux's port is called like the Port of the Moon,
Mhm.
which is a beautiful phrase in English. How did it become, a commercial center?
Sure. Fun fact as to why it's actually called the Port of the Moon, or in French, Le Port de la Luna,
Which
just
is
as pretty in French.
beautiful.
It's not any like big, metaphorical saying. It's literally just because there's this river that flows through the middle of Bordeaux, which makes it a prime wine region. It's called the Gironde, or Gironde. I don't know. I'm not a French speaker. Gironde.
I don't know.
Um,
I literally love making French people uncomfortable with my pronunciations.
so it literally just like snakes through the center of the city and it curves almost at exactly the angle of like a crescent moon. Um, so the docks that lined the river for hundreds and hundreds of years, that's literally what people started calling the moon port because it looked like a moon. So there's your history lesson of the day.
It would be so much more beautiful the way that I imagined it when I read it on the UNESCO World Heritage List. But oh well. Oh, France.
It's a lot more beautiful today than it was, 15, 20 years ago, but we can get into that when we get back into it.
So, and after the Romans come in, the first time period that is really important in Bordeaux history that non or people outside of France will have really heard of is a little lady named Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is famous for many, many reasons. But I don't think most people understand her connection to the wine that they drink today. So, how did she change the course of wine lovers' history?
Prior to Eleanor getting involved, wine from France and Bordeaux wasn't shipped outside of France. There were always all these, taxes and restrictions on imports, exports, that kind of stuff. So it really wasn't a heavily exported thing. Little Miss Eleanor got with Henry II of England, however, and got married, and he obviously wanted to take her back to England. And like any good woman, she wouldn't go without her wine. So, so she literally got the king. Between her and Henry II, they abolished the taxes that limited the wine imports into England from France. So yeah, so she put a stop to those taxes just purely so she could import Bordeaux's into England so that she could continue to drink them.
Now, because you are like a wine expert, what were the wines like that Eleanor would have had? Were they closer to what we think of today or closer to what Julius Caesar was drinking?
Well, if you're familiar with wines from Bordeaux or wines from France at all, you've definitely heard the term claret. And nowadays, I mean, you can find a claret from California, you can find a claret from South Africa, you can find a claret from many, many different regions around the world. But back then, that was literally what it was called, what a red Bordeaux wine was called. It was just usually like it's a semi-generic term that they use just to be like a very, what do you call it? A blend of any reds that they can find in the region. And as far as like the type of wine that it was back then, there's a hypothesis out there that some of the early cuttings that made their way into Bordeaux, like even back as far as those Roman times, actually came from the Rioja region of Spain.
Oh.
So I don't think you will ever find a French person who would admit that openly. So keep that on hush hush. But that's where there's not much that is the same nowadays because of that whole wine virus thing that we can get to later on. That changed pretty much the entire, grape structure of Bordeaux.
So listeners should just be aware. So Bordeaux is a region, but it's also a city. And in the city, there's a UNESCO site in Bordeaux, the Port of the Moon. But then Saint-Emilion, which was the most adorable town, is also in Bordeaux, and it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I think it's probably like the cutest French town I've ever seen. And it's worth going to, too. Not only does it have its own, like, I guess, microclimate. Is that what they're called? But it's also just a great historic
call it that.
city. Yeah. I try. So Drew was on an episode where we talked about Brussels and we talked about beer. And I just interviewed somebody about Dublin's literary pubs and we talked about Guinness. And I really do try to learn a lot about the different drinks of a culture, but I'm not an expert or even like that well versed on any particular one. It's more like I appreciate the breadth of the history of alcoholic beverages, but I don't know if I could pick one out. Like I couldn't tell you Medoc from a Saint-Emilion. If somebody told me they'd give me $1 million, I still couldn't do it.
Yeah. Bordeaux it's a region that's a little bit more difficult too, because I'm not sure how many of your listeners are American versus European, but it's
the vast majority are Americans and Canadians.
Okay, yeah. So if you tend to drink American wines, you walk into the supermarket and you pick up a bottle and it will say exactly what percentage and what type of grape it is. So it'll say Cabernet, Cab Franc, whatever. Whereas when you go to France, Italy, and I believe Spain Spain is more of the type of grape, but France especially is based on where it was grown. The way that they categorize their wines, like in order for them to say this is a good wine, it has to be a certain grape grown in a certain region in a certain style. And there's different levels of that. So it goes from like Cru to Premier Cru to Grand Cru, which is like the ultra mega, like $50,000 a bottle. So for there, like you can get like you said, for the microclimates, in Bordeaux, like if you're on one side of the river drinking a Sauvignon Blanc, it might taste like a buttery, oaky Chardonnay. If you're on the other side of the river, it could taste like a fresh, light Sauvignon Blanc, like from Australia or something along those lines. The grapes don't really matter so much. I mean, obviously they do, but it's not the number one thing that they talk about when you're talking about French wines, especially Bordeaux wines.
So that whole system, it's very political, and it's rooted in like the history of the region because so let's take the story back. So we have Eleanor of Aquitaine and now the region is opened up. How do we get from that to the chateau system?
Chateaus. Well, somewhere around like the 17th century or so was when the Dutch came in. And like how I was saying before, that up until this point, it was basically just the Graves region in Bordeaux that was the popular region. The Dutch is they're the people that you can really thank for Bordeaux regions kind of taking off. Because they actually, much of Bordeaux, because of this river that went through the middle, much of it was marshland. So it actually wasn't great wine growing areas, like as expansive as it is today. They actually went in and drained these marshlands, specifically the Medoc region, which is like I believe it's like southwest, unless my brain is twisted. In that case, it could be northwest, but either way, it's west of the river. But yeah, so they're kind of to thank for the ground actually becoming a semi-decent wine growing area to the extent that it is now. So due to political conflicts, English and French trade had halted during this period, but because Eleanor had started bringing Bordeaux wines in and word started to trickle, Bordeaux wines were still showing up in auction houses in the UK, or what it was back then, Great Britain. So they started having this like allure of mysteriousness to them. So they were getting, secretly sold on the wine black market is what I'd say. So they definitely still continue to pick up, momentum and this like aura of deliciousness around them.
But now they're like Cuban cigars and they're banned. So it's even more
Yeah,
exciting.
exactly. And then kind of what brought it into the next level was this whole wine virus thing, which I know you mentioned you wanted to chit chat about.
Yeah, so I didn't realize that there was an historically important wine virus, um, because that is not something that I learned in school. But then when I went to the Site de Vin, the museum,
C'était du vin?
yeah, and learned, and which is a intense experience. It's Bordeaux's, the city's museum that's shaped like a decanter and goes through the history of the region, the wine in the region. Um, they kind of that's from the first time I realized that this had even happened, and it's insane to me. One, that it happened at all. Two, how much it changed the history of a little bit the history of the world. So will you just tell us a little bit more about the great 19th century wine virus of Bordeaux?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't pronounce it. It's called like the phylloxera. It was just an aphid, which is just like one of those little annoying pest virus things that you can't see. But it literally knocked out essentially, let's say if it was left untouched, there would be no wine in Bordeaux anymore. It pretty much destroyed anything and everything in Bordeaux. Someone actually got pretty smart, though, and figured out that the Americans, good old Americans, were actually growing vines that were actually resistant to this pest. Not necessarily like on purpose. They just happened to have vines that were completely resistant to this pest. And back then, the capital of viticulture in America, you're never going to guess where that was. Not in California. It was in Missouri.
Of course.
That was the capital of wine growing in America, in Augusta, Missouri. So somebody went over there, grabbed some root stock, which is just like just the base of vines, and brought it back to Bordeaux and grafted them with all of the Bordeaux styles. So pretty much every Bordeaux grape out there has a little bit of American backbone to it. So you could say that the Americans saved Bordeaux wine. So this is kind of what gave birth to the 6 main grapes of Bordeaux. So after this, your Cab Sauv, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Muscadel are what emerged from this, and that's still what it is today. So those are your 6 main grapes. There are a couple others that are grown, but for the most part, that's what you get in Bordeaux.
So after America saves the French wine industry, which will certainly get
You're
hate
gonna
mail.
get shot on by
I
French
can't wait. So after Bordeaux wine recovers, how do we get from like a struggling industry that is trying to put itself back together to this like vibrant international scene that people want to go to from all over the world that we have today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this little man in the wine industry known as Robert Parker actually named a Bordeaux vintage in 1982 as the best vintage in decades. And that was kind of the big explosion that put it on the map of today's like the wines itself. The actual region was kind of a shithole up until about 20 years ago. The city itself was covered in pollution, like all of the like Bordeaux, the city is this beautiful, like every building is stone and it's these like very white, clean, awesome city. There's public transportation. It's a really easy city to navigate around. You have clear views of the river, but until like 1995, that was not the case. all of the riverbanks were covered in these huge warehouses from back when it was a bustling port. The river was super polluted. All of the city was just covered in pollution. A prime minister came in who held a special place in Bordeaux's heart, or held Bordeaux in a special place in his heart. Juppé, I believe it's how you say it. Juppé.
I could not pronounce a single French word if you cannot pronounce it.
Up until he came in, Bordeaux was actually called La Belle Endormie, which was Sleeping Beauty. Or it was called that because people said that it was in a coma because it was so disgusting.
Oh.
They knew that it like had this like sleeping, beauty to it, that it could be something amazing, but just it had been neglected for so long. So he came in about 1995 and just started cleaning everything up. I think about 10 years later, all of the warehouses were torn down. There's this beautiful market right along the river. I don't know if you went there, but there's all these like walking areas and there's always shows. There's the Mirador d'eau, which is like the largest water mirror, I think, in the world.
It's really beautiful. And I didn't go, like, I should have gone out and taken a picture, but I did it on like a bus tour and I was like, oh, I'll definitely go back and get a picture. And then I didn't. So like the most famous picture you could get in the city, I don't have that picture. I'll have to get it off like Pixabay or something to put in the article.
Oh, I highly suggest going back and taking or having about, 4 or 5 glasses of wine during lunch and then going and dancing in the mirror during as the sun sets.
That sounds
Absolutely
amazing.
Beautiful.
That is the problem, is like when you're there, you want to do so much, but you also want to drink so much, but you don't want to drink too much.
No,
so you gotta like
drinking.
pace yourself. Well, you don't want to like get sick and like ruin a day by being hungover.
Yeah.
And I was there at 33. I just turned 33. Which, if I'd been there at 23, I probably could have gone a little bit harder on the drinking, but I don't know if I would have appreciated it as much.
I went last year. It's fine. Yeah, no, nowadays there's all these cute little markets. I had literally the best mole frites I've ever had in my life. These mussels for like maybe €5, and you get like glass of wine in the markets for like 2 or 3. It's absolutely incredible. They're really, really proud of their wines and their city nowadays. It's just an awesome little city. Very happy with it.
It's so funny because to me, I think of it as like Bordeaux, this important place. It's so weird to think that that is like a more recent phenomenon.
I was talking to a woman who had been there for 20 plus years, and she's like, when I first moved here, it looked completely different. She's like, I came kicking and screaming because I was not happy with the city. You couldn't get anywhere. There's so much traffic. So there was no public transportation. The downtown was disgusting. Now it has one of the longest walking shopping streets, like in Europe, I believe. I mean, it's got all of your, high-end French designers, etc. Everything is just easily walkable. It's super safe. There's wine flowing everywhere.
Yeah.
This guy doing that was incredible.
So now that it's this beautiful city, it's been restored, and you can still kind of see the elements of, like when you walk closer to the train station and stuff, you can still see soot on the top of some of the buildings. Like you can still see the process unfolding, but that's also kind of cool because you can see what it was like maybe like 20 years ago before and appreciate the work that they've done even more. If somebody was going to go to Bordeaux for like 5-6 days, what would you tell them they have to do?
You mentioned it before. Go to the Cité du Vin. They have a really, really great beginner Bordeaux wine class that you can take. I believe it's like 20 or 30 euro or something like that. And it's, I think, 4 or 5 glasses of wine. I mean, I'm not the first person to recommend going to like the tourist thing that you're going to go to, but this thing is so worth it because it's a system that, especially if you're typically an American drinker, you're not super used to, and it'll take a little time for you to kind of get used to the French classification system. I say go there, take this class, explore that museum to kind of get the history of wine in the region. Definitely dance in the mirror. in the water mirror. Also, I feel like we kind of did an injustice by not even talking about Saint Emilion that much. I know it's technically kind of a separate entity, but
I can't decide if I want to do its whole. I feel like it should get its whole show because there's so many cool, weird stories with like the saints and stuff there. So maybe it'll come back and we'll talk about Saint Emilion later.
if you remind me, I just realized I went on a press trip with a girl who is from Bordeaux, who would probably be a great person to talk to. She can probably do Saint Emilion at least.
All right, cool.
And she's awesome. She's badass with all these tattoos. Okay. What else would I do in Bordeaux? Eat. It's a really cool city. It's just on the cusp of being in Basque country, which is a lot more southern region of France, but there are some really good Basque restaurants there. Seafood is super popular. As far as history, I think you might be the better person to talk to about that.
I would say as far as history goes, so take the wine class, but then go through the whole exhibit at the Cité de Vin, because if you want to figure out how they got from point A to where they are now, like it really walks you through the micro details and also lets you do things like try to smell different cheeses and stuff to figure, like it's a very interactive museum, and it looks like a decanter. You're not going to miss it. And then the city tour is a good tour too, for especially if you want to learn about like what happened during like the French Revolution there and stuff in the city. I would definitely do the city tour.
Yeah, there's a lot of little wine bars there. Actually, the wine CVB, it's like right in the middle of the historic area. If you go in there, they'll literally talk you through like a tasting and give you history lessons and stuff like that. I believe they do like a happy hour each day. It's from like 3 to 6 or something along those lines. That yeah, you can get like $2 or $3 pours. But there's also a ton of little wine shops and tasting things that have these like machines in the middle that they put different bottles out every day, and you get this little card and you load it with like, €20, and then you stick your card in and you can pick like a teeny tiny little taste, a bigger taste, a full glass, or an extra large full glass, which is what I like.
I have to go back. Like this is making me realize I have to go back and spend like 2 weeks there.
Yeah. No, I was there for like 3 weeks and I still just felt like I didn't taste everything, but incredible.
So if listeners want to find you, how can they find you? If they want to read more about your adventures.
You can find me on whywaittoseetheworld.com. I share the site with my partner in crime, Stephanie Yoder. It used to be called 20 Something Travel. We can't all be 20 somethings forever, so we had to shift directions, and now we're millennial targeted. So we write about everything there is. We just want to inspire millennials to get out there and not wait to see the world. You can find us, all of our handles on social media is Why Wait World. Facebook is probably the best platform for us. And
actually, I wrote a post for you guys with exactly how much money I spent on wine in Bordeaux, actually.
Stop it.
So if you, we will link to your website in the show notes, but we'll also link to that in the show notes if you want to see exactly how much money I spent.
Hilarious. I have a guide to Bordeaux. I did not keep track of how much I spent. I think we drank 2 bottles a day each. Well, in Bordeaux. Literally, that's the best way to learn about the wines of Bordeaux. It's just to drink them.
We did the fancy, like Bridget did the fancy wines. She was like, so whatever she picked, I was just like, yeah, sure, you're the expert. And then at the end of the night, I'd be like, why am I spending so much money on wine? But we drank the good ones.
No, that's the best part of Bordeaux wines. They don't, just because they're expensive doesn't mean that, or just because they're inexpensive doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that they're produced more. They have a bigger vineyard.
So I let her drink whatever she wanted because it was like her heart's desire. Like she's the kind of person that like, I want to go to Bordeaux and I want to go to the specific chateau in Bordeaux. Like that's the kind of wine obsessive she is. And I'm just never going to be able to match that. But thank you so much, Megan, for coming on. And now I have to go find some wine. I want to say thank you again to Megan for coming on the show. I love when other travel writers explain the parts of the world that have meant the most to them on their journey. And between being a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most delicious cities on the planet, Bordeaux has so much to offer history lovers. Definitely check out her website, Why Wait to See the World, for great tips on visiting this amazing region. And like I said, you can check out my actual travel budget and see exactly how much money me and my friend blew on wine and food while we were there. Housekeeping. This episode comes out on Monday, and I leave for Barcelona on Wednesday. If you want to see live videos, which my goal is to do one live video from the road every day that I'm doing something cool, and if you want to see travel photos, find me on Instagram or Facebook. The live videos are going to be on Facebook. Instagram has tons of stories, and I am History Fangirl on both. For the next month, I will be exploring Spain, one day in Andorra, and then Portugal. And I really can't wait. I've never been to the Iberian Peninsula before. I've been seriously intimidated by it because it's such a large place. It has so much history, and you know that you can't cover that much of Spain and Portugal, not even in a month. So I'm really excited to go and dip my toe in, but I know it's the first of hopefully many trips. And then actually, towards the end of the trip, I'll be in another UNESCO World Heritage wine region, the Alta Douro wine region in Portugal. And after re-listening to this episode, I really can't wait to be in another historic wine region. It should be delicious. In the meantime, if you could take a moment to rate and review the show on the podcast app of your choice, it would be ever so lovely if you would do that. And thank you so much for listening.